Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 364th New Social Environment. I'm Cal McKeever, Curatorial Assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between JoAnn Verburg and Jean Dykstra. We're thrilled to have the poet Charles North here, who will read to close today's program. A few quick notes before we get started. The Rail team will be helping out with tech if you have any questions. Closed captions are available by pressing the live transcript button at the bottom of the screen. We've started all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded lands and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. The heart of both of these acknowledgements is a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all who struggle for freedom, in recognition that when it comes to liberation, our histories never unfold in isolation. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Distinguished by its extraordinary sensitivity to the energy and sensuality of the natural world, JoAnn Verburg's photographic work combines exquisite color, varied focus, and thoughtful composition to convey the beauty of its subject and setting. For Now is her first solo exhibition with Pace Gallery on view now until August 20th. And her second exhibition in New York since her survey show at the Museum of Modern Art in 2007. Freelance photography critic Jean Dykstra is the editor of Photograph magazine. She has contributed to the Brooklyn Rail, Art in America, Dear Dave, among other publications, and has written essays for numerous photography books, including most recently, Running, Falling, Flying, Floating, Crawling, St. Lucie Books. Jean, take it away.
Great, thank you, Cal. And thank you, Fong and the Brooklyn Rail for inviting me to have this conversation with JoAnn. I've been an admirer of JoAnn's work for a long time, so it's a real honor to have this conversation. We're going to start in a minute by looking at some images from the Pace show, which, as you mentioned, is on view through August 20th, the end of this week. And the images are of olive trees in Italy, California, and Israel. And the first thing to say about these images, these beautiful luminous images, is that they are incredibly immersive. So it's, they're best seen in person. The other thing to say about these images is that JoAnn's pointed this out a number of times, but the subject matter, her photographs are not necessarily about their subject matter. The subject matter isn't beside the point, but it's not the whole story. And while these photographs, the olive tree photographs, can at first glance seem very straightforwardly photographic and very straightforwardly kind of about what they're about, they're actually, like the rest of her work, very layered and very multidimensional. And so there are art historical references, there are allusions to other artistic media, and there's all manner of philosophical and political threads winding through the work. So maybe we can start with the first piece, which is called In Motion, Petaluma Triptych. And I don't know if we have it up yet. There we go. Yeah. So JoAnn, I wanted to ask you, because a lot of the work in this show is diptychs or triptychs, can you talk a little bit about your use of the triptych format to kind of challenge this idea that a photograph represents one singular point of view?
Sure. Thank you, everybody, Fong especially. Are you able to see could you give me thumbs up if you can see the image? Okay, because I can't see it, but I know it. Okay, there it is. This photograph, In Motion, was made in Petaluma, as Jean said. And it's a really good example, I think, of the question she's asking, which is why use 3 images? First of all, if you look at it carefully, you will eventually figure out that it's not a panoramic image made from one negative. On the left, you're seeing a moment before the sun has risen. In the middle, same thing. And on the right, you're seeing the sun skim across the top olive trees. And I knew that it would happen. I knew when to start shooting from having gone to the site a few times earlier. For me, I like it that it is both, it reads both as a panoramic image of a single space or a continuous space, but then it also can be read correctly as 3 different moments, 3 different times, 3 different sheets of film. And Jean, what you're asking too about this sort of breaking out of the single frame or single image or single time has to do with what felt like the iron grip that photography can have with a single lens of saying, this is the truth. And I think the minute you have 2 pictures side by side of the same subject matter, you start to think a little bit differently. It's not necessarily a conscious thing, but it's, I think it's part of it's an aspect of looking at the work. Excuse me. So if some of you know the work that I did on the Rephotographic Survey Project back in the 70s, we went back and photographed sites that have been photographed by William Henry Jackson and other photographers, pioneer photographers who accompanied survey parties across the Western territories. And there was a very specific political objective, which was to talk Congress and people who were paying taxes back east into acquiring a mammoth area of land, the geography that then became like the next section of the United States. And in order to do that, the photographs and botanical samples and all the other things were meant to say something about the specific places that couldn't be seen by the people back east in any other way. William Henry Jackson couldn't say, hey, I'm going to do a selfie. Look at these cool mountains behind me, or whatever. You know, he was witnessing something that had a political, very important political meaning. And it is that sort of command that the single lens and single moment has that annoys me. And I think it's really deceptive. So it feels like more of a truth to have it, you know, it's not the only way to do it, but to have 3 frames 3 times. So here you're seeing before the sunrise and after the sunrise, for example.
Yeah. Let's maybe go on to the next picture, which is looking into Italy. And my question relates to a little bit what you were talking about with the 3 frames as well, which is, I don't want to get too much into the weeds on a technical discussion necessarily, but maybe, I mean, one of the things that I love about this picture, and it happens in all of the images here, is the way you play with focus and scale. And so, you know, if you could talk a little bit about the 5x7 camera that you use and the way you can sort of tilt and swing the lens so that, you know, certain bands come into focus and certain, you know, other parts in the foreground or the background, you can really selectively bring things into focus. And I have to say, for me, one of the really compelling things about this work in this particular time, the way it resonates with me, is that I actually meditated quite a bit during the you know, pandemic lockdown. And it strikes me as a kind of, they're very meditative images. And even in the kind of the way you meditate, which is to focus on a point and sort of soften all of the noise around that point. So just, that's kind of the way I was reacting to these images. But anyway, if you could talk a little bit about the way you use the camera and focus.
Yes, and I want to just briefly say something about scale, which is another thing you mentioned, Jean, that's really significant to me. And in this exhibition, as is almost always true for my work, there's something in the foreground of every image that's life-size. I shouldn't say every image, but every piece. Because, for example, in this one, it's just on the left. There's something, some of those leaves are life-size. That gives you a sense of the scale. But getting back to your question about focus, I started doing this back when I worked at Polaroid, and a long time ago, and I guess it was the late 70s and early 80s. And I was bringing artists in to use the large format camera that made instant 20 by 24 photographs. And then I got Chuck Close in to use the 40 by 80 and a number of other people after him. But there was a way in which it was a very large image being made on what was essentially like a negative. It wasn't actually negative, but just think about a negative. And the depth of field was so incredibly shallow that it was necessary to use the front of the camera where there's a bellows, front of the camera, back of the camera, surrounding the bellows. The front of the camera, you move what's called the lens board, where the lens is, the back of the camera, you can do the same. And in doing that, once you've got your image more or less in focus, you can really, I hate to use the word focus again, but focus on the specifics of what you want to have sharp, and then everything else will go out of focus. It's a plane of focus. So what I'm doing in this image, really in all of them, is thinking about what I want to be noticed first by the viewer, and creating a plane that will cause your eye to go to something sharp. And then from that point, your eye will wander around. So it's a kind of a hierarchical thing. And I think the way that it ends up working in the multiple frame pieces is a little bit like cubism, or some of those other fauvism or whatever from the turn of the century, 19th into 20th, where people were living in a, as we could say about our time, in a shattered reality. And in that case, it was war and a lot of migration in Europe. And that it felt, again, more real and more accurate and more truthful to create artworks that had to do with a whole lot of things happening at once, not just one single truth. And I mean, that's the single truth sort of reverberates for me with a sort of fascist feel. So that's where it came from and why I've continued to do it, because I like the eye moving around different parts of the whole.
Yeah, it really is a much more, it gives the image such a complexity, and really sort of demands that you spend a little more time than you might otherwise, because you're sort of trying to figure out where you are in the landscape. And it also, to the idea of sort of being immersive. You've spoken about this, JoAnn, but the idea of the relationship of the viewer to the image, standing in front of this kind of peaceful life-size image with the sort of city hustle and bustle going on outside, being important as well.
Right. There are a couple of things that you're mentioning there, Jean, that I'd love to think about. I just saw the Cezanne show. I haven't had a lot of time to get out and about, but I highly, highly recommend that exhibition if you're in New York or coming to New York. And I noticed that he does some of the same things with the tree photographs and mountain, the Mont Saint-Victoire. Did I say photographs? His drawings and watercolors in combo drawings. In the back of the show, the last things you see at the end of the show, that is to say that you don't really know where you're standing when you're looking at these landscape images that he made. And I hadn't ever thought of Cezanne doing that, but he was doing it way back then. So I'm certainly not the first. But I do like, a lot of people have actually in the Pace show, which I'm very, very grateful for this exhibition, because among other things, I wasn't really able to look at my own work in my studio. I could put up one piece at a time, but the exhibition here at Pace has allowed me to think about the relationships among the videos and the multiple frame images and the single frame images all together, which is just such a privilege. It's really been helpful to me. And one of the things that that I am very interested in, some of the people who have looked at the work when I've been in their presence have talked about having sort of a dizzy feeling or vertigo when they look at this piece, because it is in the foreground life size, and you do feel like you don't exactly know where you are standing or floating, and that you could even maybe tip into the space and fall. And that is of interest to me in the sense of sort of disengaging from the racket of New York, or disengaging from what you just experienced or thought about before you walked over to the piece. And that's a kind of disruption that art can do in a very positive way, I think, that can open anybody, all of us, me anyway, up to something that my husband, who is so much better at talking about this than I am, I wish he was the one. I wish it was his words that would come out of my mouth, but that it can, that art can take you deeper, that art can allow you to go into yourself. I mean, that's really the point, right? Is whether it's to change your political behavior, or if it's meditative, or I think of watching my cousins, the mother and the father, give birth to their third child. And there was, I became familiar with the concept of having an image to focus on when you're giving birth. And it was a very painful, physically painful experience, but looking at an image made it possible to focus away from pain. And I'm not saying that that's what my photographs are doing, but I think that art can be so powerful in terms of bringing you to a point in yourself that is where you need to be, where you want to be, the self that you want to be. So I don't want to be grandiose about it at all, but and there are other experiences that do that too. But I definitely feel that's, I guess it makes everything worth it if that can be what happens when somebody looks at one of my pieces.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Maybe we can move on to the next image. Having said at the beginning that your photographs are not about all about their subject matter, I'm about to ask you about their subject matter, and to ask why olive trees? What prompted you to photograph olive trees, to take that as your subject matter, and in these three different places, in California, Israel, and Italy?
I had photographed olive trees, I thought it was 9 years ago, but Kim Jones, who I work with at Pace, pointed out, actually it was 20 years ago. And I never thought I would go back to the olive trees as subject matter again. It felt like I'd really worked there carefully and for years, and I didn't, there was no point. And then I think it was 2016, the earth literally started trembling under my feet. I was awakened many times by earthquakes in central Italy, and they were devastating earthquakes. And people in the town after the first big one were like, oh, the women were, well, how are you doing? Are you able to sleep? And the men were, it was so interesting how it was very gender specific. The men would say, JoAnn, what can I do? There's nothing I can do. I'm not afraid. And then the second earthquake, well, there were tremors, and then the second big earthquake, the same man would say, remember, JoAnn, what I said about the earthquake. This is nothing like earthquakes I've ever experienced in all of my 85 years. And it was terrifying. I was terrified. And I found myself going outside a lot to get away from buildings, because things were literally falling off the buildings. And, these huge cement pieces were falling off the buildings, or stone. And there were the olive trees in Italy and Umbria. And I felt the familiarity, the beauty, the comfort, and it helped mitigate this fear. Didn't make it go away, but it helped a lot. And at a certain point of finding respite out amongst the olive trees, I ended up thinking, I felt called to go back. And I did. I looked at some pictures recently on my cell phone. That's how I know when I did things. And I realized it was less than a week after that earthquake that I went back and started shooting again. And once I actually had my camera out in the orchard again, I thought, I don't want to just repeat what I did before. There's no point. But I thought, is this sense of what nature is doing to me, and how people over the generations and generations have tended the olive trees. Is this something that's just Italy, that's just this beautiful province I live in, which is Umbria? Is this, is it something that happens globally, wherever there are, wherever there's a powerful natural experience? And I thought, well, what if I went to, because I studied sociology, so this is part of how I think. What if I went to places other than Italy, and what if they're separated by big bodies of water? What if I went to different continents where there are olive trees? And I'll start here, and then I'll go to wherever. And it ended up, I was going to go to South Africa, but I couldn't get there and at that moment, because the person who was going to help me find the olive trees died. And I went to, then I decided I would go to Israel, and went to both sides, and California as a representative of North America. So that was how it happened again the second time. And of course, olive trees are beautiful, and there are many, 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 many evocative meanings that olive trees have had symbolically, which is sort of the second layer of interest for me, or third or fourth. Primarily, it's just being there. I feel that it is a place where I can just let go of my big fat ego, and I can try at least, and just be there and observe and look and appreciate and feel empty as I can possibly be, especially starting with narrative or trying to feed meaning into these pictures, but just get out of the way of that.
Yeah, I mean, and this might be an odd direction to go, given what you just said about not wanting to sort of create meaning, but to just be in the picture. Maybe we can move to the next slide. But there's also, not to push this meaning, but there's also this kind of feeling of the images, especially being from these three different places, kind of reinforcing the idea of the resilience of nature in the face of climate disaster, in the face of conflict. And yet here, these trees, they just stubbornly, exist. They are still there, and they still grow, and they still produce, fruit. And there's something kind of remarkable about that too, I think.
Yeah, there are a couple things, actually many things. I'll try not to say many things, but just a couple of things. One of them has to do with the cycle, recycle of nature. And actually, this is a perfect one to talk about, and it's called 3-2-1. And it has to do with having photographed the picture on the right first. You're seeing sun before the sunset. The one in the middle was made, that negative was exposed second, and the one on the left is after the sun has gone behind the mountain. So you're actually, if you stand there for a while, or I should say for myself in my studio, when I had this up on the wall and I was standing there for a while, just looking at it, and I felt the planet. I just felt like, this is because the planet is moving. And there's something about that. That's part of what we're connected to, right? Can't get away from it. And that sense of the sun going down, which is actually the earth revolving, is one kind of tempo that I think is referred to with these pictures. And then the tempo of the life cycle of an olive tree. Some of these olive trees, not the ones that are in my paste show, but some of the olive trees that I've seen, people claim that they're 2,000 years old, 1,500 years old, or otherwise, really old. So there's the tempo of the life of the people who have tended them. There's the tempo of the dogs who were running around in the orchard when I was there. There are the bugs, there are all these things going on simultaneously. And then the human, the life cycle of the human. So am I straying really far from your question?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Well, there's also something about an olive tree being sort of human sized. I mean, there's these sort of smallish trees, actually.
Yeah, the ones in Umbria are very much human. They're a little bit bigger, but not much. And I remember seeing olive trees in southern France, somewhere near where Matisse's house is in southern France. And those were quite tall. They were like elm trees, maybe not that tall. I guess not that tall, but quite tall. So you basically, if I had been photographing those and trying to do something similar, it would have been the trunk. And there are also a lot of olive trees that are quite a bit bigger than these in Italy, where they're allowed to go taller. Now, if you think about it, it has a lot of consequences for the people who are trying to pick the olives. And it's much easier to pick olives if you trim the top of the tree and keep it short. And there are also things that people think about that I don't truly understand about getting the root system to grow out rather than down. And that has to do with how arid the land is. Yeah, human scale, I love it. This one reminds me of Joel Shapiro's sculptures, and it's called 321 for Joel Shapiro because of that. I love the liveliness of those humanish sculptures that he's done for many years.
Well, in this picture too, I looking at it again, what I love that comes up in your work again and again is this sort of lean sometimes towards abstraction and these sort of angles and forms that, it's a tree obviously, but there are also these great geometric abstract lines in them, which, I'm sure is not by accident.
Yeah, I agree. And when I'm working on the computer with these, because one of the stages of making these involves a lot of time looking very carefully at little parts, it's like eating the way I eat corn, and those are so abstract. And I've often thought, oh, I love this little rectangle I'm working on. I should just make this into the picture. And one time I needed to figure out a Christmas present for my husband. And I made a book of little details from one of the 6-part, I think it's the only 6-panel olive tree piece I've ever made, but each page, you never see the full piece. You only see sections. It's going from left to right, but you only see little sections of the whole polyptych. And yeah, and I do get seduced into looking at those little bits. Yeah. When I'm working on these and when I see them in the galleries, and then you kind of come back. I mean, I like that about these, that you don't see it all at once. It's also not about a narrative. It's not like, oh, I get it. It's an invitation. It's like
Right, exactly. Maybe we can move on to the next slide. Which is between, which also, right, this is exactly what you're talking about, this very kind of partial view. And you feel so much that you're right in the middle of this. You're right in the middle of the olive grove and the trees and the branches.
And the moment.
And the moment, more important.
The time is changing so quickly. In fact, I did 2 different versions of this, and the other one has almost no, relatively speaking, almost no orange light from the sun setting.
Well, the light, maybe we can go on to the next one. The light is something that I definitely want to talk to you about.
Oh, Jean, could I add one more thing about the last picture?
Please.
This was used, I was very honored to be invited to contribute a picture for the Spoleto USA 2021 poster. And this is the picture that was used, and it's available for, I think, $35. You can go to the Spoleto USA site, and there's a smaller, sort of this size, don't know if you can see on the Zoom, reproduction that is announcing their season.
Oh, great. That's great. The next image is a little bit different. And so I wanted to, yeah, can you talk a little bit about this one?
This one's in California. You know, I don't know if we mentioned that the one, the horizontal picture we were looking at that has the branch underneath, that's also from California. This one too is from Petaluma, California. And ask me another question. What would you like to hear about this? The cypress trees, of course, are typical of Italy, the ones that are shaped like this. And in Italy, they're often used on roads to cemeteries or within cemeteries, although not so much in this country. This is the entryway to the McAvoy Ranch, which has an incredible, I think originally it was 10,000 olive trees, but maybe, anyway, it's more than 10,000 olive trees. And I was very generously given the run of the ranch, as they call it, not olive orchard, for my work. So this is, ask me a different question because I'm not sure where to go.
Yeah, well, I actually wanted to talk to you about your use of light, and I actually wanted to talk about Big Pink, which may be the next image, or maybe it's the one after that. I'm not sure. Can we go to the next image and see? It's not this one, but it's maybe the next
That's
one, although this one is.
That's Big Pink.
This is Big Pink.
This is Big Pink. And
So,
by the way, something that you
This is
know from looking at your screen is that depending on the light in the room, I print so that it works, every piece works in daylight, tungsten light, which is like your lamps, and a mix. And this one, the pink is exaggerated or diminished by the change in light. I love that. It feels like a living artwork where you know, it is actually responding. It is in its own way immersive with a room, or that's probably not the right word, but anyway, it changes with the light.
yeah, I mean, this is, it's one of my favorite pieces of yours. The light in this just hits such an emotional chord. I think for me, that's that sort of transition period, and you know, that dusk hour when the light feels just really magical. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about the light, but also time is such an important kind of subject for you in your images. And to me, that is one of the things that this picture is about, because of the way it's happening as sort of the sun is sliding over the horizon. There's this gorgeous light and stillness. And so that sort of play and exploration of time seems to be kind of one of the primary things happening in your photographs.
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate. You know, there's the sense of time from left to right, but aside, and then obviously this is a moment in between darkness and light. It's sunset, so it's light going to darkness. But there are a couple other things. There's that sense of the liminal that I think is so poignant, period, no matter how it's expressed. Here it's the language of photography, and it's the moment of a transitional moment in the day, which is sunset, the beginning of sunset. But there's also another way that I think I've thought a lot about time, and this goes back to when I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and was working at Polaroid. And I used to go, every chance I had, I would go over to the Gardner Museum and sit in front of the music lesson, which is, I think I have the title right, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous painting about, I think it's about this size. It's hard to say because it was stolen and I haven't looked at it for a very, very, very long time. But it was in the Gardner Museum, and it's by Vermeer. And I realized, having looked at it so many minutes, so many different times in my life, that I felt something that seemed like it was very parallel to what it would feel like actually sitting and looking at a music lesson. And I thought, that is so profound. So I really find myself folding the narrative of the painting into my own narrative, which is I'm sitting and watching. And there was a way in which the boundary between the two just collapsed. And I love that. I call that Vermeer time. And I hope that and this goes way back to probably around the time I moved to Minneapolis in 1981. And I was doing different things, but among others were still lives. And I remember thinking that I was doing the life-size foreground thing in the still lives, and also thinking about how you could, like the music lesson by Vermeer, you could fold your experience of standing in a gallery, your breathing, your, you know, whatever you were listening to could fold into the subject matter of the still life, so that it almost felt like you were looking at the objects rather than a photograph. And that's been something I've carried into these pictures of olive trees as well.
Yeah, I love that, how it's not just the time that's passing in the image, but the time that's passing or pausing in looking at the image.
Right, exactly. So it's a duration.
Right, right.
Even though you know it's not.
Sorry, even though it's not?
Even though it's not, right, even though you know that it's not a duration, it's a fraction of a second. Well, it is a duration, but it's a fraction of a second.
Right, right. I think the next image might be one of just two where there's figures.
No, that's
Nope,
not
that
it.
one.
That's
Not
yeah,
it.
there it is.
There it is.
Mhm.
And this one is Olive Trees for Robert Frank, right?
Right, right. This is those of you who know The Americans, Robert Frank's book of black and white photographs called The Americans. Those of you who know it inside out and carry it around like an encyclopedia in your head might recognize this picture as having been influenced by the encyclopedia in my head of a man. Somebody I'm sure out there knows which picture it is. I don't know the title, but it's a man standing behind a stairway, and the stairway is going like this in the upper right corner and blocking out his head and part of his shoulders. And you see his legs and part of his torso in the midst of this architectural space. So that, you know, where do these pictures come from? They don't come from nowhere, but they come from a lot of somewheres. And that happens to be one of my many influences is Robert Frank's photography and many other artists' works and snapshots. I mean, I sometimes say to people, oh, I love this picture on your cell phone. Will you send it to me? So that's part of it, you know, whatever. In this case, I actually was in the middle of or at the end of shooting at this site, which is outside of Spoleto, Italy. And I saw my husband, who I sometimes refer to as a wanderer, just standing more or less in that place. And I did a cell phone picture. And then I said, would you mind posing for me, please? Because he goes out for his own purposes sometimes with me, and he writes poetry. So I don't want to interrupt him, but he looked like he might be interruptible. And he was very generous and walked over and stood just the way I wanted. No, turn this way, da 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 da. Hurry up, the sun is setting, you know, the whole deal. And this is with the 5x7, but based on a snapshot and based on Robert Frank and probably based on a million other things.
I mean, I just have to say that's one of the things I really love about your work, is that there are all of these references that you wouldn't automatically think of. I mean, you wouldn't automatically think that you've been influenced by Robert Frank. Your work is very different. You know, you work in color, not black and white. You're not sort of social documentary kind of street photography, but it finds its way in, just like, you know, the idea of contemplation and time and finds its way into your work in a premiere, which is something you wouldn't automatically, oh yeah, I can see that influence right off the bat. And that's what I love about your work. It's so rich in that way. There are so many influences and so many references.
You know what occurs to me listening to you say that, Jean? It's so bizarre, because I agree with you. And at the same time, I have the same experience after the picture's made. If I'm thinking about that, which seems really strange, but I don't think about that stuff before. If I did, I couldn't make the picture. It would get,
Yeah, right.
it would be an impediment. It would be a real, I would be in conflict with that thought. And I need to just get to a space where I'm not really thinking, period. And then it's like whatever floods in, but I'm not conscious of it. It's coming in. I'm not saying it's not, but it's not something I'm conscious of. If it is, it's a problem. And then after the fact, it's like, duh, of course it's influenced by XYZ. I remember taking work when the way that you showed people your photographs or your paintings or whatever, you'd either get them over to your studio, which people wouldn't do for photography, or you would schlep them in a portfolio to the curator or dealer or whoever, whatever other artist you wanted to show your work to. And I must have lived in Boston, because I was going to show it to, I should say Cambridge, because I was showing it to somebody at the Museum of Fine Arts. And I ran into Chuck Close. And I think this is what happened in my memory. The way I remember it is that was the moment that I realized in my portfolio, I had these big heads pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, here's Chuck Close. Oh, yeah, I was influenced by his work. And I had been very conscious of the fact that I was living with my husband. It was the first time I actually was living with somebody. And I'd wake up in the morning and there was this giant head right next to my head. And it was like, whoa. And that was after I saw the pictures, that I was very conscious of that input in my life being influential. Yeah. But it was later that I realized, well, I wasn't doing them the same way, Chuck Close. They didn't look like Chuck Close pictures, but just the idea of doing these pictures where the head filled so much of the frame, I'm sure it was influenced by his work. So it's funny how it all works. I mean, we all influence each other all the time in so many different ways. And right. I love that. And in fact, when I was doing the multiple frame heads, and I don't think you have any slides of these, but they were influenced by, or that what I was working with was this idea that we are who we are because of the people we're surrounded by at any given moment. And so they were these, 3 or 7 or however many heads. Yeah. And it looked a little bit like yearbook portraits, except that somebody might have their hand on the shoulder of the next person. So there was an overlap. There was a sense that these people really were together.
Well, there's an interconnectedness, right? And right. All of that, everything that you see and take in and think about, it fertilizes the soil that your art comes out of. So it's not that it's a copy of anything.
Right. And I think, you know, if you think about the yearbook portrait, it's a construction that suggests that this person is just this person.
Right.
Whereas if you see, you know, something where like a multiple frame piece where it overlaps, there's a sense that there's a context that feels complicating in an interesting and accurate way to me.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a photograph of your husband, and I think the next one is also, American Man.
Mhm.
That's also of, yeah, love this picture. And this is kind of a good segue, I think, into some of your earlier work. This is a photograph of your husband, Jim Moore, who's a poet, and you know, in a grove of trees, holding a newspaper. And you have taken many pictures of Jim, and in many of them, he's holding a newspaper, or sometimes the newspaper is kind of partially concealing him. In this case, he's kind of partially concealed by the branches. But I was wondering if you could talk about the function of the newspaper in some of your photographs, because I think it functions in a really interesting way, and that I want to come back to in your photograph later that we're going to show, the missing children picture, of the way it sort of brings us to a current events kind of situation, doesn't let us completely. It's such an idyllic and beautiful photograph, but there's this newspaper that sort of like reminds us that we're also in the real world. We're in two places at once, or maybe more than two places at once.
Right. And they did start with the still lives. And I think it really had to do with wanting the text, which is almost always readable. In this case, it's not. That's unusual. But I wanted the text to suggest something outside of the frame. And I guess that's a little bit like what I'm talking about when I talk about the multiple frame, and the use of the multiple frame is to suggest something other than this monovision way of looking at reality. And that there's so much going on outside of any given situation, any given relationship, any given moment, you know, whatever you're looking at in the room, you know.
Yeah.
That the newspaper, well, the way I often use it, although not necessarily, is to bring in, it's always that day's paper. I have a rule. I don't have very many rules, but one is that if I use a newspaper in an image, it has to be the newspaper from that day. So I don't like, you know, carry around a cool image on the front page of the newspaper and wait for something that it goes with. It just feels like there should be some simultaneity there. There should be a sense that there's more going on than what you see in the frame. And it's often bad news. It's often something going on in another part of the world, or it's almost always something in another part of the world that is in counterpoint to, in this case, it's very lyrical picture. And although you can't read the text or even totally see what's in the image, you know what newspapers are. So, and in this was the last picture that when Kim and I were choosing the work for the show, I really wanted them to, I didn't know if she was doing it on her own or not, but let's say her, I wanted her to really seriously consider this piece. And I didn't know why until I actually made a good print of it. So it's funny, when I am printing, I don't really know if it's going to work. And it's not about just getting the subject matter right. It really has to do with a lot of things, visual components that either come to life or don't when I'm printing. Yeah. And in this case, after I finally got a good print of it, I realized I absolutely want this in the show. This feels key, but I didn't understand why. And then when I saw it up in the exhibition, I realized that it had to do with, okay, the thing that's life size in this image are the grasses in the foreground. So you're standing, the grasses are in between you and the man, an American man is the title. And so it separates us from him, as does his gaze downward, as does his expression, which is not inviting. He looks like he's stumped or in between thoughts, or, you know, it's not clear, but he's not inviting you in. And the newspaper suggests to me, when I saw it up with the other work, that one possibility is that he would look up and see the viewer. One possibility is that he'll turn around and just be engaged in this gorgeous place where he's standing, this beautiful light. And one possibility is that he'll pick up the newspaper, you know, maybe even hold it like this, like my father used to do when he would come home from work, as in, girls, I'm relaxing now, don't bother me. You know, this
A barrier.
a barrier, yeah. So the newspaper, you know, it's, I guess I don't really want to say a whole lot more than that, but it does function that way. And I thought in the show that there was a way in which the choices that the viewer has in any exhibition were somehow in relationship to what is going on with him, the paper, and the beauty of the place. I don't know that I can really explain it, but it has to do with those things being together in that picture.
Yeah, yeah. I think the next picture is Blue Jim. And so this is now, we're leaving the Pace show and going back to, or just to some other images. And I just love this image. And I just wanted to ask, you know, what it's like to photograph Jim over and over again. And this may be one of the kind of the heads you were talking about.
Yeah, I don't know that I really can answer that question, Jean. I think it's a perfectly valid question, but I don't know how to answer it. I guess it's different each time. I know I can say this, that's sort of related to what you're asking, that after 10 years of being with Jim up close and personal, that I was asked to do an exhibition in Minneapolis by a guy named Vance Gellert, who was one of 4 people running a nonprofit gallery in Minneapolis called Parts Gallery. And he said, do something that you wouldn't do for a gallery. And I said, and after a while, I had seen a show that Adam Weinberg actually did when he was, I don't know what his job was. Maybe he was the collections curator or something in the old Whitney in the Breuer building. And it was, I think it was taking a period of time like the 20s or something. I don't remember, but he did a floor to ceiling salon style display of all these paintings from the collection. It was a really cool show. And I thought I wanted to just go through the mess of images that I'd done for 10 years of Jim. But unlike Adam's show, I wasn't just showing final work. I was showing test prints, contact prints, collages that I'd done of him. Some of them were just parts of test prints where I decided I didn't think it was going to work as a final print, and I just pinned them up. And then there were final things in frames and final prints pinned. So it's a real mess. And it was 3 rooms that were either floor to ceiling salon style, just crammed in there, or else they were just rows of test prints in which I showed the pictures that I chose and the pictures that I didn't choose. And the thing that seemed kind of right about that when I saw the whole thing was that a relationship is like that. You know, there's certain moments that stick out. Like, I hope I always remember last night looking at the sky over the Hudson River with Jim. And we were both just like, this is so fucking fantastic. You know, it was just like, you're out of your body. It's so beautiful. And I noticed on Instagram, I went on just for a second this morning, there were all these pictures of the sunset last night. And then there are other moments where I'm so bored and it just isn't working, honey. I know I just have to get away from you right now, you know, or whatever. And it's all part of it.
Right.
And the exhibition showing the ones that are really look like stupid pictures to me. Like, how could I make such a stupid picture? Putting those together with the ones that I felt somehow, I don't know, had vivacity and a sense of life and a sense of, it wasn't about, yeah. So it just felt right together. And one of the odd things I'm just remembering talking about the show for me was, even I did not have a sense, looking at, it was over 300 pictures, looking at Jim, I did not have a sense of who he was. I mean, I know who I think he was when I'm with him in real time, but looking at the show did not give me him, which was really interesting.
Well, it's interesting about this picture because it's such a kind of a paradox, because it's so up close, right? We're like looking, you know, his head fills the whole frame, but there's also kind of a refusal on his part. His eyes are closed. He's not looking at us or at you. And so that's sort of a little bit of a refusal too, of to be only partially available, maybe.
Yeah.
It
Probably true of all of us all the time, right?
Right.
You're
And
as available as you can be, or whatever, or as you want to be. I
Right.
want to mention that this is this big, this picture.
Yeah.
This picture is life size. So his head, whatever it takes for his head to be life size. And I don't take a ruler to his head, but I will make him stand next to the tusk print to make sure, you know, sometimes it's a hand, sometimes it's his head, whatever part is life size in the image. But yeah, and I think in counterpoint to that refusal that you're talking about, because the eyes are closed, there's a very generous look on his face.
Absolutely.
So sort of.
Well, that actually brings us to the next two pictures, I think. Maybe move on to the next one.
This hasn't been made yet. This is me with the little, this is me taking a, it must be a self shot of my video camera. Can you see that it's just from his shoulders to the left and part of the tree?
Yeah.
And you've got the whole version on the computer screen, right?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of one of the things I loved about this, was actually it's such a, it's a picture of your process.
Yeah.
And about the whole thing, but also what you're making of it,
Mm-hmm.
which is really wonderful. And then also, let's go to the next picture.
So you don't have the picture of the screen that has all 6 of that last one?
No, I guess not.
Okay, it's fine.
Yeah.
But it's basically similar to this, except they're 3 above and 3 below.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that picture and this picture, which connects a little bit to the head with his closed eyes, you have quite a number of pictures of Jim sleeping or napping or resting, or kind of, and they're so beautiful, and they're so, to me, not only an example of a loving gaze, but also an example of, and I have to admit that I read this in a different review about one of your shows, and now I can't remember where, but it's this kind of celebration and an insistence on the value in repose and in resting, and a kind of a refusal to buy into like busy, because there are quite a lot of photographs of him resting in this way, and it's kind of like a celebration of taking this time and taking a pause and resting. And then in addition, and this image seems so referential to so many art historical images to me, the fruit and the kind of the rumpled sheets and blankets, and I just love this picture. And there we have the newspaper again, but it's kind of off to the side. It's sort of fading out of the picture. So yeah, maybe if you want to just talk about this image a little, I really love it.
Yes, yes, and yes. And it's very specific in its art historical references, by the way. This was shot in Venice, where I go back and forth between, you know, Jim starts his day writing, and I start my day looking at looking at art and walking. And then I usually want to shoot in the afternoon, and he usually needs nap number 1 or nap number 2 or nap number 3 in the afternoon. So he's often my subject matter during that period of time, you know, it changes, different trips, different years, whatever. But the center panel here is Cézanne. And I knew that because I was going to use, or if I used a long exposure, there's this thing called reciprocity failure factor that shifts the color blue, cyan blue. And I love the way Cézanne uses those colors in his still lives. And then there's a sense, and of course, if you've read about Cézanne, people use the word movement, and, you know, even though it's a still life. And then on the right, there were a lot of things Matisse. I was looking at a lot of Matisse around that time or prior to that time. And there's this wonderful thing about how things are tippy in space. And I remember there was, I'm sure it's not something I can quote correctly, but one of Renoir's art students apparently was complaining about Matisse and how things were like this in his still lives. And Renoir purportedly asked, are they going to fall off the table? And the student said no. And he said, yeah, you're right. And then that's good. And I think that thing that Matisse does, where you feel like you're out of balance and in balance at the same time, feels emotionally correct to me. Or trying to find balance when the world is out of balance would be another way to put it.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the left is daily life. The left is the world. So putting those 3 things together was, I was able to, and by the way, this was a funny one to shoot. He was awake when I shot the one on the left. And when I shot the one in the middle, I needed for him to be asleep, because if he moved at all, I had the tripod leg. When I shot the one in the middle and the one on the right, the tripod leg was actually up on the bed. And if he was moving at all, it would have, it would have made it a blurry picture. So there was quite a bit of, if you had seen me shooting this, you would have had to have laughed. It was like a comedic experience to make this picture.
It's really, really exquisite. It's a beautiful picture.
Thank you.
And there's some similarity in the next picture, which is a picture of, I think I'm right that it's the next picture.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah. Of Maurice Berger and Marvin Heiferman. This is also such a beautiful image. Similar themes of kind of repose, similar, the newspapers are there, but they're not reading them. If you can talk a little bit about the making of this picture, it's just a beautiful image.
It's interesting to be asked that, Jean, because I love this picture. I really love this picture. And I think you're seeing it pinned up as 3 prints, by the way. That's what the gray is. Oh, yeah, yeah. You can see the little push pins, so that gives you a sense of the scale. But I haven't really thought about the moment of shooting it very much. I just look at it as what it is. But I'm remembering now that this was fairly early in Marvin and Maurice's relationship. And they were still working out things like Maurice, as you can see, there's a bird in his frame down at the bottom, a taxidermed, I think it's a pheasant. And then there's a landscape image on the pillow under his head. The frame they share is politics, the news, stuff that's going on in the world. And on Marvin's side, there's the television and the travel section. And I'd forgotten about that when I was setting it up. That was part of what I was interested in, about these two different people coming together and how we're so different from each other, period. And in this case, you know, combining into a couple, how you bring different things into the relationship, and some of them are compatible, some of them are not compatible, some of them are not compatible, and then they are compatible, you know, and so on and so forth. It's a living thing, a relationship. It's a living, breathing, changing thing. And this had to do with just the beauty of what you're talking about, the beauty of rest and repose, and then also and taking time out or time in. Maybe it's really taking time in, taking time on when we stop, and at the same time referring to these other aspects that go on outside of the so-called moment of this frame, which is not one moment. I want to say one other thing about that. I don't think I said this, about that show where I had 300 plus images of Jim. The person who had asked me to do the show said after we hung it, "You're really," talking about me, "you're really peaceful. You really have a sense of peace." And I said, "Actually, I don't. And that's why I need to do these pictures." Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I had looked at this picture more as one picture, but it's really wonderful to see it the way you've described it, with the one on the left is just Maurice and kind of his interests, and the one on the far right is just Marvin, and then in the middle they come together and they're holding hands, and it's a beautiful portrait of a relationship too, which is really wonderful. I want to move on to, you mentioned this early on, the
Rephotographic Survey.
Yes, the rephotographic, exactly. And just because it's kind of one of your very early projects and it's so interesting, I just wanted to show two pictures from that series because I think it's really interesting, and also there are some threads that connect it to other work that you've done. So maybe you can just describe, you kind of did already at the beginning, but maybe just talk about these images.
Well, you brought up the word time, and this is so seminally a project that had to do with time.
Yeah.
On the left, you're looking at William Henry Jackson's photograph, The Gateway to the Garden of the Gods, which was owned by a farmer in 1873 in central Colorado. It's near Colorado Springs. Actually, it's sort of eastern and slightly southern Colorado. And although you can't tell in this black and white image, which is originally an albumin print, the rocks are pink and sort of coral color. And then the photograph on the right was made by me and my partner, Mark Klett, in 1977. And it was a specific, as precise as we could get match in terms of the lens position of the camera and the time of day and the time of year and the framing. We were trying to make an exact match of William Henry Jackson's picture without manipulating the site itself at all. So the idea was that it might be interesting to see these two pictures side by side, printed the same size. We made copy prints of Jackson's pictures, and then we made our original prints the same exact size. And we published them ultimately after 3 years of field work as a book called Second View, a Rephotographic Survey Project. So that's the outline of what the project is.
Yeah, it's an amazing project, really. And then the next picture, I think, shows all of you.
This is not actually technically a Rephotographic Survey Project. What this is the gang of us who made a film about the Rephotographic Survey Project process It's never actually been edited or turned into a movie. You can see it's a real movie camera there Ed is holding. But it was one of the most famous site of William Henry Jackson's was the one on the right, which I've cropped and then added my contemporary shot over it, called the Mountain of the Holy Cross. And by the way, photographs lie. These are the classic examples of photographs that were used to change the world. America had to own this property because, among other things, God had put the Christian cross on a mountain. Yeah. So that business of how photographs' meanings are used by people was part of what we were interested in. And it was fascinating going to the sites because, of course, the sites don't look like the pictures. And I'm not talking about the changes over 104 years. I'm just talking about the fact that there's noise and there's air and there are birds and there are animals and there are people talking and they're big or they're smaller than what you thought they were going to be. And there's weather and there, just all the things that make so-called reality.
Yeah.
And the reality in a picture is not the same. I mean, there's a huge gap there. So that's a lot of what the project had to do with, trying to use all the techniques we could to make an exact representation and failing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just
an exact double. Yeah. Sorry. Excuse me.
Wanted to just show a couple of them. It's such an amazing project. And I just want to kind of encourage people to go look at more of these because I think it's just an incredible project. And maybe leads in a sideways way into the next work that we're showing, which is the after before pictures. Sort of a sideways way because it has to do with, this American sort of idea of land ownership and claiming land and then so terribly misusing it, right? So these images are sort of you're pairing images of a piece of trash sort of in its quote unquote natural found environment, and then you've kind of made a portrait of or a still life of that object. So here's a bag floating in the water, and then kind of a more portrait of a bright pink plastic bag. And then the next one, I think there's a plastic cup floating in the water, and then you've made this portrait of kind of a bottle and a cup that's a little more of a formal still life. So maybe you can just talk a little about what the process was, what your thinking was.
Jean, I love what you just said, and I don't know that I have a whole lot to add to it. I think you said that so beautifully, but it does have to do with the fact that we obsess about stuff in our country and in our culture and a lot of places on the planet. And as the first curator of this as an exhibition, and by the way, it's something I only show at university galleries, although I would show it anywhere where there's a cross-disciplinary group of people who would be involved, because I want other people to be involved. And, it would maybe take a little more time than we want to spend for me to explain what I mean by that. But there was a wonderful little book made that was part of the exhibition experience by a group of philosophy students at Colorado College who were organized by Jonathan Lee, who's an amazing teacher at Colorado College. And then when it was shown at Ohio Wesleyan, there were a lot of really wonderful additions within the gallery context itself. For example, some of the freshman students found trash in the local river, painted it white, and they did, without knowing who Janice Cornelis did, they basically did their version of a gorgeous Janice Cornelis sculptural environment of trash, beautiful trash. But anyway, I mean, I think you've said pretty much everything, but except that I can also add that the way it's made, the way that these pieces are made, is that I wander around sometimes in the morning when Jim is writing, but really all times a day with a snapshot camera. And it's been, started out with one of those snapshot cameras where no, I never did it with film. Sorry, I take that back. It's always been digital. It's always been a phone, a cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
And then after I see the pictures, which is immediately, I start looking for an equivalent. So in this case, it's a plastic cup. And then I go to my hotel room. They're always in Venice. These are always junky things floating in the lagoon. And I make a still life in my room. And I don't know why. People have asked me why Venice, and I don't know why, except maybe it has to do with it being an empire that is now essentially a tourist site, and thinking about what that means, how powerful, they were literally putting gold leaf on the outsides of buildings in Venice. And I mean, you think about commodification, colonization, just all these capitalism, these, I guess those all start with C, all those C words, and how we obsess about these things. There are objects of desire, and then there's the trash can, and it goes, do you ever think about it again?
Right.
So, and what are the repercussions of that? So that's why I like doing it, this show, the exhibition version, and there have been each place makes its own catalog with the same images and different texts. One of them was slanted toward art and philosophy, and the next one was slanted toward science by the different departments at the different universities. I've done it twice so far.
It's just such a great way to, it's one of the great abilities of photography, I think, which is to really focus and hold still an image that we would, that's something that everyone walks by all the time, the junk in the, the Venice Lagoon or the East River or whatever, and to kind of really hold it for a minute and consider it is really important.
I'll tell you, I cannot throw things out anymore without paying attention.
Yeah. Well, the next image is, I think, the last still image. And I just love this image so much. It is so beautiful. The color is so gorgeous. And it's also, to me, such a smart image. And this gets back to your use of the newspapers a little bit too, which is that it is this really incredibly beautiful, peaceful, lyrical image of, a breakfast table and coffee and orange juice. And then at the middle, there's this little twist of a sort of distressing piece of information in the missing children ads that used to be on milk cartons all the time. And they're not even really in focus, but they're there to sort of upset your kind of peaceful view, which is just, it complicates the image in such a terrific way, I think. And it's just, I think, another example of a lot of your still lifes are like this. They're much more complicated than you think if you just give them a quick glance.
Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate your interpretation of this picture very, very much. This was made, the business of bringing text in, I talked about a little bit, with the newspapers, showing something that isn't in the frame. But also the moment of sitting at the breakfast table feels, I don't know if I can explain this very well, but I have beat myself over the head a lot about why my pictures are not more overtly political, and they don't overtly express my politics, and they don't change the world more in very simple sort of formulaic ways. But one of the things I think is that I used to go on marches during the war in Vietnam, and I do participate, but in terms of my art, in terms of making photographs, I've ended up working with what I think of, it's not literally, but necessarily, but the kitchen table a lot. And I realized that for me, at least, my politics are formed more in quiet moments than they are in the shrill moments. When I have a conversation with somebody I respect, and I respect what they're saying, which is, you know, a lot of times, for me, it is really effective if it's a conversation in a context of calm, more than like at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper, or having the radio on, and listening to a story while I'm still having my first coffee, or you know, I haven't engaged in the business of the day yet. My mind's not fully awake. I'm not fully speeded up for the day. And yeah, so I think that was one of the reasons I started putting the newspapers into these daily life kinds of domestic still lives, is because it felt like that is the time when things can change you really effectively, I think. Yeah. And I'm not saying it doesn't work to have people get up at demonstrations and talk. That's really, really important. But in terms of my work and the still lifes that I have done, and the portraits where I've added the newspaper, or if Jim's sleeping and I slip a little newspaper in, an article in there, whatever, you know, those counterpoints between friendship and the paper, or what's in the paper, or my relationship with my beloved and what's in the news, you know, those counterpoints. I think there's something about that combination that maybe it relates to thinking of the landscape as being also a location that can be disrupted or disruptive. Yeah. It's something about wanting both of those. I don't know if I can put it into words, but wanting both of those aspects of consciousness and reality and beauty and ugliness in a picture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a really beautiful picture.
Thanks.
I think we're going to end with the I don't want to not see one of your videos. So we're going to end with one of the videos.
There are 3 of them in the show. It's probably the proportion, something like, you know, 1 to 5 or something like that, 1 to 7, something like that, of videos, few videos and a number of still photos.
So maybe we can just watch this quietly because there's some beautiful sound. It's so beautiful, JoAnn. I say I can sort of feel my heartbeat slowing while I'm watching it.
I'm going to give away some secrets right now. I'm going to tell everybody in the world right now that when we were installing, a couple people said to me, don't tell anybody, but every moment I have, I find myself coming over to that video and just standing here and chilling out, which is really such a nice way to start the exhibition.
Yeah,
I have somebody say that to me.
it's really, really incredible. I think we can open it up for Q&A now.
Great.
Anybody
Thank
has
you, Jean. This has been a truly wonderful conversation. You know, I've seen the show twice now, and this has made me want to go back before Friday for a third time.
Friday at 4, get here before 4 o'clock.
All right. So we got a couple good questions, and if anyone else has more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But first, we'll be going to Jeffrey Bishop with something to say.
Oh, hi, JoAnn. What a wonderful talk. And I just jotted down a thought. Now, I guess I'll just read it. Was going back to the olive trees, especially appreciating the exquisite delicacy of many of these works, duration as so fleeting. It's almost as if the leaves in the foreground of some works are as much in sway of the breath, your breath, as to the light breeze caressing the leaves. I imagine you occasionally being hyper aware of your own breath as you're focusing your images. In the picture of Jim with newspaper, I can almost feel his breath also as he stands in contemplation. Your breath, his breath, and the breeze and leaves in between. Not a question exactly. That's what I jotted down in the chat. So anyway, great to see you again. It was wonderful to walk the exhibition with you a month or so ago.
I totally agree, and I hope your knee is okay, but we can talk about that later. Jeffrey, thank you. And I'd like to add, I don't think about anything when I'm shooting, but I do think about when I'm looking at the pictures up, when they're actual pictures, that I don't want there to be a separation between the air in the picture and the air in the gallery. And of course, the air in the picture is in your imagination, and the air in the gallery is the air you're breathing. But I like the idea that there's not a clear boundary between the two. So I don't really think about anything when I'm shooting. I'm trying to figure out how to make a picture.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. And we have another question in the audience from our friend G.E. Schwartz. That's to unmute you.
Thank you. Do you think or even believe maybe your work has a kind of kinship with luminism, which is before some of the other things we were talking about earlier? And I'm thinking specifically of Piet Mondrian's The Red Tree, which is such a compliment and a connection to, I think, what your work is doing. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or not.
I don't know the painting, so I can't really comment. Is it before he started doing his
yes,
abstract
yeah,
work?
he did a series of trees and and other things that are very much, you know, that almost look like they could be, you know, at the same time as the sun. And it's illuminated by light, and it's illuminated red, and it isn't. I think it's a fig tree. It's not an olive tree. And the other thing I was thinking of today too, when you were showing them, is I kept flashing back to this wonderful, amazing story that the New York Times did of the olive trees in Afghanistan and how they were all shorn completely down, destroyed. And then poppies were obviously began to grow and grown and cultivated. And then they were bringing the olives back again, the olive trees back again. So we hope that anyway. I just can't get beyond thinking of those olive trees today too. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that in. Yeah, the olive trees have had quite a role in wars. People destroying olive trees so that other people wouldn't have a livelihood or wouldn't have food or wood. Yeah, among other things. Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible side of the history of olive trees. As far as the Mondrian, thank you for clarifying a little bit which body of work of Mondrian's you're talking about. I love that early work of his. And
You probably can't see it, but here's a tiny bit of it on the cover of the book.
okay.
So anyway.
So does it appear that the red is from the sun, or does it appear that it was bounced in from somewhere?
It's a twilight sun
Okay.
that he did it, and he waited for that time, and he had to work very quick to try and get it. He was working live, so to speak, as of course you do. So
Thank you for bringing
thank
that
you,
in.
yeah.
I'm going to definitely check out that early work again.
Mhm.
There's one at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, which we now call MIA, of his still lives that I really love. Every time I see it, I do a whiplash. Whoa, that's an amazing picture.
Mhm.
They always look so simple,
Yes.
but I can't stop looking at them.
That's why I thought of your work today too, you know, in conjunction with it. So, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, GE. There's a question from an audience member who sadly had to leave, but I can ask it on his behalf. Igor asks, do you consider yourself as a part of any artistic movement? Were you influenced by any photographers of theory? I think you have a lot in common with Henri Bresson. His theory that photography can capture the meaning beneath outward appearance, an instance of extraordinary clarity.
Oh, what a nice thing to say. Thank you. Say the name of the person again.
Henri Bresson, or
No, I mean the name of the person who made the comment.
Igor.
Igor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Igor. If you ever see
I'm
this.
still here.
Oh, hi, wherever you are. Are you
Oh,
here
my apologies.
in a box?
Yes, it is in the box, and
Where are you? I'm looking
I-
for you. There you
I'm-
are. Hi, Igor.
I'm so sorry.
I'm calling from North Macedonia, and I want to ask you about your concept of reality. Nevertheless, Henri Bresson, he was always in this mode that I presented here in the question. Although sometimes he was photographing some people from the public life, like Truman Capote or Samuel Beckett or other intellectuals. But anyway, he was always reflecting the reality which was behind the form. And I think that you are reflecting the form behind the reality. In a way, twisted Bresson you're presenting. So what do you think about it? Am I right when I say that I think that you have a sort of theoretical or artistic influence by Bresson? Thank you.
Probably, although I'm not conscious of it, because when I started in photography, I mean, I'm not talking about my childhood snapshots, but when I started actually, okay, Peter McGill, Clark Winter, and Phil Fix were three students at my school who, because of the war in Vietnam, long story short, were allowed to teach a class. And they started the class with a slide tray, and Cartier-Bresson was featured very prominently in the group of pictures. And he was part of the small group of photographers we learned about extensively, because we didn't have that many photo books in those days, and certainly not like today. And you know, the library, in the art section of the library had about this many photo books. So yes, he was one of the early influences. I love what you're saying, and also bringing in the portraits as well as this concept of reality. I don't know, I haven't read what his concept of reality is, but I do. First of all, let me say, I usually, when I use the word reality, I usually say so-called reality. So that may tell you something about my feelings about reality. And I think reality in a photograph is so different. It's a language, right? It's so different from moving around in life and experiencing. They're related, but they're not the same. And I think Cartier-Bresson's portraits are very evocative of something about humanity. I also think in both cases, they're probably mine and his.
Investment strategy, you have to understand.
They're probably self-portraits as much as they are, it's a portrait of a relationship, I think. That at least for me, and I have a feeling this would be true for him as well, if Cartier-Bresson is photographing Cortege, say, or let's say Matisse, because I can think of that one really clearly. Something about Matisse's work brings out something in Cartier-Bresson that ends up being expressed in the image. And it would be different from if he's photographing a philosopher, for example. I also want to bring in a kind of unrelated thing, but I think it's really interesting about Cartier-Bresson, and it kind of sort of relates to my work, which is that I didn't realize that he sent his rolls off without seeing the work, and they were published without him having seen the work. There was a show at MoMA, I think it was Peter Colassi's show, and I found that really fascinating because he didn't have to think about what the image looked like if he was using, say, Polaroid or a digital camera, where you actually look at the image as you're continuing to shoot. And in my case, I found it very useful to use sheet film, which I send away, and I don't actually proof it until maybe a month later, 2 months later, 6 months later. My last trip that I took, which was to California to photograph olive trees, was in March, April, May. No, it was, what was it? It was February, March, something like that, April. It ended in April, end of April. And I haven't seen that work. I still have a couple boxes of negatives I haven't sent to the lab. When I get that back, I will be able to critique it or analyze it or whatever, which is when I start being conscious and thoughtful in those kinds of ways that have to do with pictures, not shooting. And it's helpful to me to have a break in between, a pause in between. And on this day, I'm shooting and I'm trying to get the critic that sits on my shoulders off my back. And that would include all the theoretical reading I've done. That would include the analyses that I've read that are very interesting to me, but I don't want them in my conscious mind when I'm shooting. When I go back and I'm looking at proofs, then it's a whole different story. It's a different set of problems. So I think that relates, Igor, to what you're asking, although I'm not answering in a simple, direct way. I'm answering in my JoAnn Verburg, very indirect way.
Thank you, Igor.
Yes,
All right.
it is. Yes, thank you. Thank you for answering it. Thank you for answering my question, but in a way, by not answering, you answered.
Okay.
All right. So next we are going to pop over to my colleague Malvika, who has a question for you.
Hi, JoAnn, and hi, Jean. I've loved this conversation so much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for being here. You're such a beautiful talker. I have a question, but I wanted to say, first, I loved what you said about the olive trees and their role in war occupation. This is something I've been thinking about a lot the last couple weeks with like olive trees and their raising away being both like a way of salting the earth, but like a way of producing a revisionist history of the past that implies that there were no people there, then, there was nothing there. And that feels like something clicked for me and kind of tracks with some of the work you shared. More broadly, I really loved, I agree, you produced such an atmosphere of calm and space in a way that really resonated with me throughout the conversation, from your daily routines to your comments about the value of repose as potentially a kind of resistance or non-buy-in to even Venice is the seat of empire that's now degrading in that way. It's just also extremely smart and beautiful, and so happy that you came on this Monday. My question is really simple. Typically we have a lot of art students, young artists, young art writers, people sort of in that world in the audience, and I'm wondering if you have any advice, whether in the structure, in the form of advice about routines, advice about mindset, perspective, advice about like not buying into certain things and what is valuable to buy into, if anything, or even advice about craft for young people trying to kind of solidify a practice. And then for me, more specifically, I'm also wondering, personally, how did you make the flip or the transition from photo into video? You know, I'm wondering, like, do you feel like they're operating on the same logics, or did they just happen at the same time? It was very easy. Is your preparation or your process kind of, are you thinking differently for both? I'm asking this more specifically if there is an answer, because I'm a photographer and I've been sort of aching to make the move into video, but wondering about the learning curve and not sure how to navigate that shift. But more generally, the question is like, do you, have any advice that you feel like offering us in the room?
You've asked so many beautiful questions. Would you help me out by, I'm going to start with one of them, and then would you, can we break them down? Because they're all so valuable and worthy of, the concepts are so valuable and the questions are so worthy of being addressed. And I know some of what you're saying is going to slip through the cracks. So I'd like to start sort of chronologically for me with when I was in junior high, and my father, I was at a ball game, and it was one of these like kids doing a ball game for a fundraiser kind of thing. And there was a photographer who came as a visiting dignitary, and he was sitting in the bleachers, and my father introduced me to him because he knew I was really interested in photography, even in junior high. And I don't remember everything. It was the same question about advice. What advice would you give? But the one I remember, and it's been very good advice, is to draw. Because I think drawing is such a wonderful tool for seeing. And it gives you a reason to have a duration of time where you study what something looks like. And it's, of course, not just what it looks like that's of value, but just the whole of life, what's behind it, how it's shaped, what the light is, how does it feel, just lots and lots of things that you can experience when you draw. Whereas, as we all know, for better and for worse, where's my camera? Boink, it's over. So that would be what I would say about that component of your question. That, and start out, don't stop yourself. Don't make yourself not take a picture. This is a different time in my life when I was in graduate school. Alexei Brodovich said to, I think it was Hero, but it might have been a whole class of his students, which was like Diane Arbus and Richard Avedon, and really amazing, brilliant students. He said, if you pick up your camera and you see a photograph, don't take it. And I think what he was really saying is just go as broadly as possible in your idea. Don't limit yourself with your ideas. Try to shoot whatever you're inclined to shoot. And then later, when now I'm going to go to John Tchaikovsky, which was probably even later in my life, who said the decisive moment is not when the photographer goes click, it's when the photographer looks at the contact sheet and decides this is the one that's the real picture. So you can decide stuff later. I feel the same way about writers. People say, well, should I write about this person? Their feelings might be hurt. Well, you can decide that later. You can cut it out. You don't have to publish it. But if you really feel compelled to take a picture, or even a little bit compelled to take a picture, take it, and then it's later, you edit it out. You don't have to show it. Don't worry about it. Just go where your heart leads you. And you can figure out what is valid to share with others at another time. So then I think voice, your own voice, which is not what you were asking, but I think it's related to your questions, that develops because, and oh, who's this? Rauschenberg. I'm quoting everything. Somebody said to Rauschenberg, does it bother you that people copy your work, that other artists make work that looks like yours? And he said, they can't make my mistakes. And I think that is so smart, because what voice is it's, I think, this is my personal opinion, is it's coming to terms with embracing your mistakes. I mean, it could be any number of different kinds of mistakes. It could just be you accidentally clicked before you meant to, and you weren't even conscious of it, but then you look at it and you think, oh, there's something about this that's interesting. You know, it could be that, just an accident, or it could be something else entirely. You know, there are just a million different versions of mistakes that could be useful. So I'd say, you know, that's really where voice comes from, is your own individual self, is not just when you do something that's correct, but when you do something and you recognize it on the page, so to speak, as a proof, or you know, something in your phone or whatever, you know, we're actually looking at an image and you see something that isn't even, or maybe is, well, it isn't what you intended necessarily, but it's something that you want to do again. And then you go out and do it on purpose, maybe, or you do something else because you're trying to do it on purpose and it didn't work, whatever. But so I'd say that would be another bit of advice, was don't legislate yourself too much. Don't edit yourself before you even make a picture. And try lots and lots of things. And out of that will come something of interest. And if it doesn't, then do something else.
Thank you for your questions, Malvika.
What are the other millions of questions that you put in there?
Unfortunately, I have to interrupt, and we have to move over to our very own Fong Bui. He likes to give some remarks at the end, and I'll hand it over to him. Fong, you're there.
Where is he?
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. Thank you, JoAnn. Thank you, Jean. Thank you so much. I must say that while listening to you mentioning and reference Cézanne's show at MoMA, the whole idea about art is slowing down time. And the viewer should pay attention in order to slow her down, him down, them down, and ask thoughtful questions about why the way thing appear that it does. And I remember very clearly when Picasso, having seen Cézanne's show after Cézanne's death in 1906, there was a memorial exhibition, and Picasso said to his friend, Casamegas, or may have been other poet's friend, I don't remember, maybe Apollinaire, where he say, don't study Cézanne's painting so much, but study his anxiety. And I think that's very interesting. Anxiety is exactly the drive, the motive. However calm your photography, your picture appears, JoAnn, there's a lot of underneath anxiety that you have to moderate, mediate, and in a way engender it in a way that it can be embedded, like the way that Cézanne's apple is titanic with anxiety underneath. And I always remember D.H. Lawrence, when he first showed that famous Cézanne show in 1911 or 12 in London, where it was coined post-impressionism. It was curated by Roger Fry. And D.H. Lawrence came and showed the still life, and he said Cézanne's apple is like the moon because there's an unseen side to them, you know? So I feel listening to you just now in and out with Jean, especially G, just to make a side note here, G, the Mondrian painting that you refer to is called the Tree 1909. And that's the year that he entered Theosophical Society. So there's very loaded with symbolic significance, which we won't have time to go into now. But just thinking in Jim's poem, I think I have a copy here somewhere in New Yorker. Recently, Jim, you wrote a poem published in New York, in New Yorker magazine, maybe in the March issue, where you mentioned I always wanted to write a poem that ends at the ocean. Am I right, Jim? And I think that's very interesting because when you make remarks about Cézanne landscape, there's no invitation to the foreground. He never want you to invite the viewer in there. He want to amplify the anxiety of the onlooker, the viewer. He demand that sensitivity to look at the picture. And I think that's where it's about, in a way, it's whether we can think of it as a spatial discrepancy, dissonance, rupture, or even in a sentence of a poem, a punctuation that trapped the space, you know? And I think that's where it is. But lastly, I remember seeing your show at MoMA, that was in 2007. And in thinking about Jim's poem, in a way too, I don't have time to stay with Charles when you come on, read at the end, Charles. But I remember Bill Bucks and you to talk about your work. And I know that you have also a very specific interest in urban idols. And Jim as well, a deep interest in ancient Asian poetry, definitely. And it's very interesting because for me, looking at JoAnn's work, I can't help but to think of a very prominent critic of Cézanne. His name is Fritz Berger, who wrote a very incredible essay on Cézanne before the World War I began. With all the expressionistic pathos and exaltation. I think it might have been 1913 and whatnot. He said that Cézanne, quoting from a very beautiful letter that Gauguin wrote about Cézanne, saying that Cézanne is like an Oriental Levantine, a mystic, sitting on a mountain top, reading Virgil. So it's very interesting to tie together the idea of the grandeur of nature, but the anxiety of the observer, the maker. Both together have to be coexistent and simultaneity. And we don't even have time to go talk in space and time, whatnot, which is very Kantian, which we'll talk maybe when I see you, JoAnn. For now, thank you so much, because I had to jump up to another meeting. But thank you, JoAnn. Thank you, Jean. It's a wonderful show. And for those who haven't seen it, I highly recommend it to see. And hopefully I see you in person very, very soon. Thank you.
I hope so. I hope so. Thank you, Fong, so much for making this happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, Fong. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And so, as Fong mentioned before, I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Charles North, to the stage. Charles North has published 11 books of poems, including Complete Lineups, 2009, What It Is Like, New and Selected Poems, which was on NPR's Best Poetry of 2011 list, and North of the Charles, Early and Uncollected Poems, 2018. So without further ado, Charles, take it away.
Thank you. You can hear me.
Yes.
Thanks. One thing occurred to me. My guess is that you don't know, but my first book was titled The Year of the Olive Oil. So I thought maybe you were putting us together, but my guess is not, correct? Okay, anyway, had I thought more clearly, I might have chosen to read that. I thought I'd read a few short things which have some connection to painting in honor of the Rail. Some of the connections to art are a little tenuous, but I like the idea and I like the Rail, so it seemed to me a nice idea. I just want to say one thing about the conversation. I thought it was wonderful too. I loved seeing the work. I loved hearing the extremely intelligent conversation. And JoAnn, an awful lot of the advice that you have given to photographers is exactly what I would tell, and in fact do tell, aspiring poets. An awful lot of it. See what happens, essentially, is what you're saying. Don't have it all in your head when you go to do it. So I couldn't like what you said more. Okay, so just a few short poems, again, with some connection to art. The first couple are kind of, they were inspired by a series of poems the poet William Carlos Williams did long time ago called Pictures from Bruegel, which some of you may know. They're pretty straightforward presentations of mostly very well-known paintings by Bruegel. I guess the genre is ekphrasis. And I decided a few years ago to try something similar, same overall title, but very different sorts of poems. Rather than presenting, I'm kind of playing off the idea and changing the titles and taking slices of individual paintings, details, and so on. And I'll just read a couple. They're little prose poems. The first actually, you talked a bit about philosophy, JoAnn. The first is actually a title that's a takeoff from a famous philosophical essay written by the contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel about consciousness and other minds and so on. I don't know whether you know it or not. It's called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" One of the seminal essays towards the end of the 20th century. My poem is called "What It Is Like." I'm sure you'll recognize the painting. Two pensive monkeys chained heartbreakingly to a metal ring in a high, thick-walled window arch, no glazing, which looks out behind on a pale harbor and filmy blue and green city in the far distance. Clearly, the monkeys are conscious, have consciousness. We know what it is like for them to have given up hope and to look only inward, while appearing to stare at the ring imprisoning them and the space just below the window in front, between it and us. And the second, which is also from a well-known Bruegel painting, and of course I've changed the name. It's called Conversation Group. Another prose poem. A gold swath or path. Apart from a few at work scything and baling, wearing Walt Whitman white work shirts. A silent conversation group, eating, drinking from bowls, slicing bread, not looking at each other or in any way beyond the self. Two faceless balers behind bend into V's like the teepee shapes of the bales already formed. Close up, the inner life. Middle distance, uncut except for path, wall of hay as thick as several houses. Jump cut to long shot, blue-green grass and trees, paler gold thatched roofs and flattish roll of hills. Far away water, strips and necks of flat coastal land. Atmospheric mist. I actually have a new book. I guess maybe Bruegel liked my poems because he did the cover for the new book. It's called Everything and Other Poems. Everything is the title poem, which is about 30 pages long. Anyway, this is a poem that one of my friends has called Painterly, so I thought maybe I would read it to you. The title is it's a takeoff from a Thelonious Monk title. It's called Crepuscule with Paula. Does realism get your vote? It gets mine. The plants with their insatiable thirst for appearances. The heart-stopping 7 p.m. air moonlighting as a pressed cardboard Korean ashtray, server, modest coaster, decorated with a single blondish branch, holding 6 leaves and a piece of rose-colored fruit, pear, plum, ripe peach, slightly raised as if applied to the flat creamy space behind, flecked with light gray, light green, and brown marks of varying size, from pinpricks to ashes, pencil, it looks like, to brush. The romance of the window panes, I'm squinting a little, has nothing to do with the misguided view. The one with the fates schmoozing under the maroon awning of the high-rise. Schmooze is more like it. And the embarrassed-looking sycamores revealing for all their worth, in their slightly fictionalized but emotionally accurate way, which contributes to the overall tone without detracting from the realistic participation. A motorbike taking the corner too fast, a cat knowing the worst that can possibly happen and managing to avoid it, which could be the key signature, if not for a freestanding radiance just outside, unmoored, a hint of plum or Anjou pear. And I thought I'd read a couple of little ones from a new book that's just about to come out. This is it's artistic in that it's a collaboration with a friend of mine, the poet Trevor Wingfield. I don't know if you know his work. And the first one is pretty clearly art. It's called Limits of Outdoors. How the roar of a motorcycle isn't equal to love, any more than puffs of chimney smoke dotting the burrows reach out to the earth's imagined corners. There are 5 burrows. You think I don't know that? Or that I don't take every other word out of my mouth with a grain of salt, if not a tablespoon? Even the relatively healthy window plants know what they're about, without a hint of egg tempera or Baroque halos that look like gold dinner plates. By Andrea del Verrocchio. Foothills with bands of trees and a far-off mountain like a pale blue breast. And this other little one, maybe it's a stretch, although it is in this book, to call it to say it has an art connection. I think so. It's called Fishing. Into the evening, especially if you don't count the twig-like intimacy or the front matter that would sneak out of the collected poems if it could, if no one was looking, whatever the cost to the facts of the matter and their less than resourceful cross-hatching, amounting not exactly to tree shade, but thick enough to imperil the passage from now to then. Front matter plus the bluffs and prominences, taller than the ornate tower on the municipal building. The last one, again, I guess it's sort of painterly, but it's also titled Study, which is something I associate with art, not with poetry. And there is this, the title poem, which this book ends with, is 30 pages, and it starts with a page and a half called Study for Everything. This is the last one I'll read. Tenure schmenure, the sages are all on the Hudson River Pier. Don't lean over too far. I wouldn't be surprised to see arms and legs, even a vital organ or two, representing the shy, passive-aggressive inner life. Brushing out followed by brushing in. If people in high rises shouldn't groan, neither should the brownstones huddle closer together each time there's a hint of autumn in the air or in the trees. Like, if you'll pardon me for saying so, rushing to cremate the dead when everyone, themselves included, knows we want them around for as long as humanly possible. Not, of course, that the pangs have much choice regarding where to settle or be observed. A rusty hydrant is as good as a park bench. The handful of pigeons poking around a chunk of baguette near the grass don't seem to agree, but they're hand-stamped, inks, some line too, already beginning to fade. I only know what I know is one version. Another, as witnessed so many royal portraits or the parade of experimental drugs for a dread disease, is that knowledge works only some of the time, really works. Never mind how things seem as opposed to how they see themselves, or why appearance stakes so much, if not everything, on the distinction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you, truly. And thank you, JoAnn, and thank you, Jean, and thank you to everyone who tuned in today and for all your questions. This has been a really, really great conversation. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation between Edward Zipko and Paul G. Miller, aka DJ Spooky. We will conclude with a poetry reading from Gabenga Adesina. You can now turn on your microphones and say goodbye as you leave.
Thank you, Cal. Thank you so much.
Truly my pleasure.
Thanks, JoAnn.
Thanks.
Thanks, JoAnn. Thanks, Jean.
Thanks,
Thanks,
JoAnn.
Charles.
Betsy, Jean.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, JoAnn.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, JoAnn. Great poems, Charles.
It was a year ago.
JoAnn.
Thank you.
Well,
Bye-bye.